We're in this series around stewardship and giving and all of those wonderful things that we have. And so I wanted to talk today around generosity. And I've had quite a bit of a think about generosity and what does generosity actually mean, and to describe generosity. And I put up a little thing on social media just saying, love some feedback, what does generosity mean to you? And quite a few people actually responded, and a lot of them were ones that you would expect, like giving freely without expectation of return, or just being kind to people, and some of those kinds of things. Somebody wrote giving something, be it material or not, without expectation of anything in return. Another person spoke about the gift of time that people give. I loved this one, that for someone, generosity was simply talking to someone over a cup of tea or coffee. And again, I think that reflects the time one, just that time to be generous with our time with one another. There's another one here that talks about someone giving up time to spend with you, even if it's sometimes late, being selfless and not expecting anything in return. And I love what they wrote at the bottom of this. They wrote to love without being loved back. And I just thought that's quite profound, isn't it? And what a challenge that generosity is, to love without being loved back. So I really like that. There were lots of others on that one. And you can probably, if you want to look me up, you can probably see it there and see all the answers that people gave. I also, in the process of preparing this, discovered that Australia ranks 5th in the world out of however many countries on the World Giving Index. Did you know that there was a World Giving Index? I'm sure you went, yes, everybody goes, yes, I knew there was a World Giving Index. The World Giving Index is, it looks at financial giving, volunteering, willingness to help a stranger. Now, they say that Australia does pretty well on all of those, except over the last little while, they've been sliding a little bit on the generosity measure. But I was fascinated by what they actually used as the generosity measure, because to me it's kind of, it is generosity, but they used the tax office and the number of people that claimed what they could on their tax returns, and that has been slipping. That's really interesting, isn't it? That the way that they talk about financial giving relates on what you deduct from your tax. And I thought that's not generosity at all. That's just getting something back for what you gave. And it also made me think about how many people actually give and don't claim it back on their tax for a number of reasons, either because they don't earn enough to be claiming it back on their tax, or because they just choose not to. And look, I'm not having a go at you if you claim stuff back on your tax. We've all done that. I'm just saying it's not really a great measure of what generosity really is. It's a measure of giving, but it's not a measure of generosity. And so I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? So I also thought then about the book called The Generosity Factor, and if you want to read it, it's a bit of an allegory, really. I think it was written by Ken Blanchard a number of years ago. It talks quite a little bit about generosity and what it really means to be generous and ways that you can be generous. And then I thought of how generosity is actually about taking the focus off self and putting a focus on the other person. And for me, that's I think the key thing for generosity is the focus is not on what I have or what I can give, but on the other person. And then so this is my rambling thoughts, okay? This is where I went with this as I started to prepare this and plan it. I then started thinking about blessing and how blessing flows from a heart of generosity. But then I also started thinking how blessing is really just something that's the state of our mind, because what I perceive to be a blessing, someone else may not. So blessing is a little bit, it's not a material thing, but there's so many things that we call a blessing, and it's really only how we perceive it. Other people may not perceive it. So I think about, we sometimes as human beings, especially here in Australia, we receive things, oh, what a blessing it is. What a blessing it is to live in Australia. Well, yeah, in many ways it is, but what about everybody else who lives everywhere else in the world where things are really tough? What do they see as a blessing? Me living in Australia is not a blessing to them in any way, shape or form, unless I'm proactive in helping them in some way. What about people who don't have things? What about people who have just lost their job? I say, oh, we're blessed, Brian can still work from home. Great. But what about my friend who can't work from home because their business doesn't work like that? What about the people who can't run their businesses at all and are relying on them? Where's the blessing in that? And so it's really interesting. When we talk about blessed to be a blessing, and I just thought about how blessing is such a mindset that we have, and we want to bless other people, we want to be generous, but I just want us to be a little bit aware about, I guess, what we call a blessing, and understand that it's okay to say it's a blessing, but who's it a blessing for? I kind of think of this in a social justice sense. We've just had NAIDOC week. Oh, I'm blessed, we live at Horsley and we've got a great block of land, and whose land was it first? Not mine. And the people whose land it was first are not feeling particularly blessed by me building a house on a block of land at Horsley. So where's the blessing in that? And so I think we do have to remember that what we have comes from God, but even that causes me some problems when I think about what we have, because we've got a lot of stuff here in Australia, and then I go to Vietnam and I discover people who have hardly anything at all, and they still seem to be pretty happy and saying that, God's blessed them in a different way. So I don't know, this might sound a little bit rambling, but if blessing is bestowed upon all of us, why do some people end up better off than others? This is the question I wrestle with, because what we might call a blessing may have actually come from a benefit that we got that was an unfair benefit in the first place because of our privilege. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit warren of that today, but I do just want us to think about what we call a blessing, why we call it a blessing, and how it actually may affect other people. See, I've benefited from being in what we would call a privileged class. My skin colour means I'm privileged in this country. And so what I call a blessing isn't necessarily a blessing to other people. What I have has actually come from an unfair privilege. And so how do I address that then? What do I do with that? I'm still wrestling with that. I haven't got an answer for you. But it makes me ask some questions. What's my responsibility toward others? How am I personally addressing injustice? What if my blessing is someone else's hardship? How do I handle that? What do I do with that? So when I came to thinking about blessing and generosity, I decided I was going to focus on the generosity side of it, because that's something that I can be in control of. It's not something that happens to me. It's something that I can give and be part of giving to someone else. And so I came up with this little thing about generosity is actually giving even when it hurts and even when I don't feel blessed. It's always for others and it's always generational. So true generosity has the future of someone in mind. I'm going to read a scripture and you'll recognise the last part of it. And I just got to bring the lightness up on my phone so I can actually read it. So it's Isaiah 32, and it's verses 1 to 8. And it says this, "Look, a righteous king is coming, and honest princes will rule under him. Each one will be like a shelter from the wind and a refuge from the storm, like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of a great rock in a parched land. Then everyone who has eyes will be able to see the truth. Everyone who has ears will be able to hear it. Even the hotheads will be full of sense and understanding. Those who stammer will speak out plainly. In that day, ungodly fools will not be heroes, scoundrels will not be respected. For fools speak foolishness and make evil plans. They practice ungodliness and spread false teachings about the Lord. They deprive the hungry of food and give no water to the thirsty. The smooth tricks of scoundrels are evil. They plot crooked schemes. They lie to convict the poor, even when the cause of the poor is just. But generous people plan to do what is generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. So if we have a look at that scripture, I love it because it actually talks about generosity. We often just take that scripture and talk about generous people, and I will talk about that in a minute. But there's a few things here if you put that in context, because there's a really clear juxtaposition here that is made between what the ungodly do and what the godly do. And it talks about a righteous prince and a righteous king is coming, and honest princes will rule under him. And I look at that and we know that Jesus was and is our righteous king, and he has come. And then people rule under him, honest princes rule under him. So people who honour Jesus are honest people. That's a challenge, isn't it? Because in a way it's talking about all of us. And it says this, each one will be like a shelter from the wind. Well, we got a good example of wind yesterday. We put up this great structure in our garden. It took us forever to put up, I might add. It was really tricky and difficult because, like most cheap things that you get from China, they don't fit properly. Well, the wind knocked it down last night. Hooray! So we have to put it back up again. Not very sheltered. Our dogs have a kennel out the back so that they can shelter from the wind. When the wind is strong, we want a place to be able to shelter. And it says that people who rule under the righteous king provide shelter from the wind. And so as followers of Jesus, are we providing that shelter from the wind and the storms? It says that we'll be a refuge from the storm. Streams of water in the desert. You know, when things are tough and dry, are we providing streams of water for people? I think about that now, and I put a little post up on Facebook a little while ago. But what will we be remembered for? What will the church in general be remembered for? Will we be remembered because we complained about having to wear a mask in church? Or will we be remembered because we were streams of water in the desert? Will we be remembered for being caring and taking care of those who are affected by COVID, whether it be those who lost their jobs, or what is it as a church that we will be remembered for in 20 years' time? When people look back, will they see the church universal as kind and caring, a shelter, a refuge, a stream of water, and like being in the shadow of a great rock in a parched land? For those who've lived out west or have visited out west, you know that without the humidity, there's a huge difference between shadow and sun. And so that difference, you know, you're out in the sun and you're parched and you walk into the shadow and it's refreshing and it's cool. That's the kind of honest prince that we're meant to be in the kingdom, that we rule our own lives in a way under the kingship of Jesus, so that we are a shelter from the wind. And it says when we do that, everyone who has eyes will be able to see the truth. And everyone who has ears will be able to hear it. I love that. That talks about transformation, doesn't it? It says even the hotheads, here's a hothead around here. We can all be hotheads at times. Even the hotheads will be full of sense and understanding. And that speaks to me of transformation, the transformation that comes when we look to Jesus as our King. And so let's have a little bit of a look further down. There's this description of the ungodly, and if you look at it, it really, in a nutshell, talks about false teaching, lack of social justice, plots against others, pretty much the opposite of what generosity actually is. And then it says a generous person or generous people plan to do what is generous and stand firm in their generosity. And I did look up some of the Hebrew words for this to try and get a bit of an understanding on what they meant. But it does talk about generosity there as being voluntarily generous, magnanimous, liberal with things, and noble. And some translations actually say noble people. And so it's freely given. It's freely given. It's a generosity. A generous person gives freely. And I love it says that they plan to do what is generous. Some translations, the King James Version talks about they devise good plans. I love that. But it's about purpose. It's about deliberate. It's about coming together. And part of it is even about counsel together. So generosity is not just an individual thing. It's a collaborative thing that we do as human beings. And so not only is generosity voluntarily generous, not only are people magnanimous and liberal with things, but they are purposeful in what they do, and they make a plan and they counsel together. And then it says, and they stand firm in their generosity. And it says, when I looked this up, there's a meaning around to rise intensively and causatively. In other words, to accomplish, to rise up and to accomplish. To stand established, confirmed, and fulfilled. And I think about that because we can be generous in heart. We can have a mindset of generosity and want to be generous. And we can plan to be generous. But if we don't stand firm in it and actually make it happen, then we've missed the point. And, you know, we all have... I mean, if you're like me, you've had lots of great ideas, lots of really good intentions, lots of ideas of ways that we can be generous. And we might even think about it and plan it out, and then somewhere it gets lost. Well, sorry, that's not generosity, because generosity is carried through to the end. It accomplishes something outside of ourselves. So you could kind of say that generosity for us as Christians is, as followers of Jesus, seeking Him, living honestly, and then giving generously, voluntarily, magnanimously, in a way that is planned and purposeful, and actually take action on it, so that the people who receive the generosity, and that our intention for generosity is carried through. And I like that. And I think generosity has, you know, both this personal and corporate aspect. It's a personal one because we are personally generous. It talks here about a generous people plan to do what is generous. But it also talks about that collaboration. And as a church, we collaborate together to be generous to our community. We collaborate together. Part of the reason we run the ADHD Fun Day, and I know sometimes we get tired and by the end of it we're pretty much all dead. But we do that to be generous to our community, to carry through on that idea that there are people in our community who have families living with ADHD. It's not easy. And as a church, we can reach out to them in a way that is loving, kind, and generous into our community that has a broader impact than anything we do sitting here in church on a Sunday morning. Sorry, guys. I am not against sitting here in church on a Sunday morning. I think it's a great thing to come together and worship together. But whatever intentions we have doing that, if it's not outworked in our lives, if it's not outworked in generosity in our community, if it's not outworked in generosity even toward our own families, then it's not generosity. And so that's just really, I guess that's just really important to me, and it's kind of my heart. And you know, the truth is that at times we can be incredibly generous, and if we're really honest at others, we can be really stingy. We're human beings. We make mistakes. We don't get it right. But the interesting thing about generosity is the choice is ours. The choice is ours to be generous. When we receive a blessing, it's not our choice. But when we give, and we give a blessing or we're generous to another person, then that's our choice. And at every given time, we can choose what it's going to be. We can choose to be stingy, or we can choose to be generous. As individuals, we can choose to be stingy or we can choose to be generous. As a church, we can choose which way we want to go. Are we going to be stingy in the way we interact with our community, or are we going to be generous in the way we interact with our community? So giving generously of time, giving generously emotionally, giving generously financially, they're all the things that I think are really important. And yes, we do those without bankrupting ourselves and without bankrupting our emotions. But when we look after ourselves, when we follow Jesus, when we care about it, then we have the ability to be generous. I just want to leave it there.